and we'll use that as a basis.
We'll certainly have him on again if that happens.
Certainly, yeah, I suppose so. Inevitably, though, again, if this is just, we could use some of these same arguments that he's using about the Gospels and turn them around and use them for Gamaliel. We don't have any first-hand copies of the Talmud. We can see a struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and these other Jewish groups happening. And we can say that Gamaliel was invented by the Pharisees to give themselves legitimacy. I mean, when it comes to this kind of idea, you can suggest anything you want to in order to come up with some reason why there was some sort of tampering done. And so, this, like I say, this is simply it's contrived methodology in history. It's not based on evidence. It's based on a presupposition that something has happened, and we need to find out what.
I would comment on that the presupposition is on your own part, JP. I mean, you are a committed Christian. You take pride in being the hardest-hitting apologist and the rest of it. I mean, I have already confessed the fact that my opinion changed. I thought there was an historical Jesus until I tried to find the evidence of one. I'm not dogmatic on the point. If in 10 years' time I find evidence for an historical Jesus, I'll be very happy to come on this show and explain why. But the problem is I'm not seeing them. I'm not hearing them from you. You know, I'm hearing defences, but I don't hear, any strong evidence here for an historical Jesus. And we have a much more plausible explanation for why in the 2nd century there was such fractional division within the Christian movement. There were so many contending factions and heresies because they didn't know what to believe until it was hammered out. And then it became authorised in their various Gospels that are now in the book we have today.
JP?
Now, these are very vague summary statements that really don't make an argument for anything whatsoever. And if we want to, again, I don't play the game of confessional interest or bias or what have you, saying, I'm a committed Christian, well, Bart Ehrman is not, and therefore then what? Well, he was brainwashed and he's still brainwashed now, etc. We could just as easily say, and this is said tongue-in-cheek, well, Ken has a website and he's trying to sell a book and he's trying to sell T-shirts and mugs or what have you, and therefore he has a reason to defend this point of view. I'm not actually saying that's why he's doing it, but if we want to play this game of he has an interest, he has a bias, that's why he's defending it, again, it's simply a diversion from the evidence. Now, we're talking here about different views of the Gospels. I like what he said about history is written by the winners. I remember Dan Brown saying something like that. My general reply, polemically speaking, is, yes, it's written by the winners and complained about by the losers. But let's see. What we have in terms of these fractions...
The losers are dead, actually.
So are the winners, for that matter, in many ways. But let's say, now if you want to talk about, say, the Gospels in particular, we don't have first-hand copies, no, and we don't have first-hand copies of any of these ancient works, and yet I've yet to see any historian or any scholar make an issue of this for any secular work. We don't have first-hand copies of any of the works of Confucius. We don't have first-hand copies of any African poems written by some of their ancient people. This is simply not an issue, and that's why we do textual criticism.
I mean, on that basis, I've often heard it said that, in fact, while people like Ken may make some issue about we only have later copies, in fact, the copies we have are dated a lot earlier than many of the manuscripts we have for evidence of other great historical characters. We have closer and better manuscripts than many other historical characters.
Well, yeah, now we don't have time to get into all the details. That's in my next book, but if you're going to make comparative claims, then if you're going to throw out the New Testament, and you're going to have to throw out every other major historical work from the ancient world, including Tacitus, including Livy, including Suetonius, and including the Talmud. It's all going to become a blank slate, and we may as well adhere to the thesis that history actually started with the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages were a fraud, which is a real thesis, by the way.
So there's the problem then, surely, Ken, that if you're discounting the Gospels because we only have later copies, we don't have the originals, and then you're kind of denying us any history. Surely.
No. I mean, we get the danger of creating a caricature here. Let me answer part of what JP has said here by referring to something. It used to be a standard comment in my emails from Christians that there is as much evidence of Jesus as there is for Julius Caesar. Now, I heard that so often, I did write an article specifically on Julius Caesar to illustrate how we can have a great deal of confidence, in fact, complete confidence that Julius Caesar existed because of the mass of interlocking and mutually supportive evidence. Now, that's different when we come to someone like Jesus. We don't have a mass of interlocking and mutually supporting evidence. We have evidence of generations of doctrinal disputes. We have the Gospels from the Marcions. We have the Gospels from the Docetists. We have, evidence of all manner of heresies that, strangely enough, emerge very early on in this so-called religion. And, it's less plausible that the pure doctrine suddenly metamorphosed into 80 or 100 heresies than in actual fact the truth is probably that out of that whole ocean of religious thinking, certain ideas crystallised and eventually were given official form in the faction that happened to then manage to cement itself into the Roman political system.
And are you saying that the Gospels then are effectively the crystallised thoughts and traditions that won the day, if you like?
Indeed I do. And if we have time, we can trace through. Let's take the very basic fact that we know about the Synoptic Gospels, that Matthew and Luke are based upon Mark. Now, most scholars, I don't know if JP does, but most scholars will agree that is the case. Now, what is the relationship there? Mark wasn't one of the disciples. He has not claimed to be an eyewitness, and yet Matthew supposedly was one of the disciples and an eyewitness. Why does Matthew, an eyewitness, copy the text provided by a non-witness? I mean, that's the sort of nonsense that you have if you try and take the official story as being valid. What we have in Mark, in its original form, was a much shorter gospel. It had nothing about the birth of Jesus. It had nothing about the resurrection appearances. A very brief document, which in Matthew and in Luke was embellished and developed into a much more comprehensive doctrine.
I feel like we're opening a whole new area here, and unfortunately we're already approaching near the end of the show. So I'll allow JP to respond, and then we may have to start to wind things up.
Okay. There's not much. I do have articles on each of those issues that he's mentioned. My article on the virgin birth covers the issue of Mark not mentioning it. In terms of the Markan priority Q thesis, I do adhere to Matthean priority. I have great detailed articles on that. But
what do you mean by that? Just for those who may not understand quite what.
It means that Matthew wrote first, or I believe it was written in Aramaic or Hebrew first, and Mark wrote later or at a different time independently of Matthew. Both are based on the common oral tradition that the
okay, so both Mark and Matthew both depended on an earlier source.
Yeah,
so it's not Matthew copying Mark; it's them both copying an earlier source and Matthew incorporating that into his eyewitness account.
Right, oral tradition, and Luke, I do think, had hold of an early form of Matthew and of Mark. Now, I'll just go back for this topic to the issue of Julius Caesar. I have an article on that too, and there's a lot of issues involved in that, like. Do they mean it's usually connected to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in the analogies I've seen? And there's some question, do you mean Caesar crossing it personally, like stepping over the river himself, or does that mean his army crossing, and so on? And what I concluded is that this is not really a good analogy to use for Jesus. The better analogy was someone like Gamaliel or Socrates, who was a teacher, not a military leader, not someone who was a great force in government, because that does not describe Jesus adequately, especially not as the pagan writers would have seen him. And this is a critical mistake that's often made, and I've seen it on Ken's website as well. He asks why various people like Appian or Plutarch don't mention Jesus. Well, again, we have this confusion between Jesus as a person and Jesus as a miracle worker. When you have someone like Plutarch, let's say he hears about Jesus for the first time. Well, he's not going to be willing to grant that this Jewish peasant who was shamefully crucified was actually someone who did miracles. He's simply going to dismiss that as an unworthy story without any further investigation and not report it. And so we can't be expecting these authors to adopt the viewpoint of the Christians, as it were. Otherwise, they would be Christian sources if they agreed that Jesus did all these miracles. Or they'd be like Celsus and say, well, he was a magician of some kind, learned his craft in Egypt. The practice, again, we need to compare to comparable figures like Gamaliel, like Socrates, like Confucius, who were teachers with a circle of disciples. We would mostly expect the followers to provide the information about that person. As with Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, mostly his followers wrote about him. With Gamaliel, we have mostly the Talmud. In the case of the New Testament, that's where we would expect the most information to come from Jesus.